War creates images of brutality, deprivation, and suffering. In the Pacific theater of World War II, few expected mercy on either side. The Japanese army, bound by the Bushido Code and a cultural aversion to surrender, considered capture dishonorable. American soldiers, in turn, remembered the ferocity of battles on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, where surrender was rare and resistance often suicidal. Against this backdrop, the idea that Japanese prisoners, especially women, might describe American prison camps as a paradise on earth seems almost impossible. And yet, when historians compared the treatment of Japanese POWs in American custody with conditions in Japanese-run camps, the difference was stark. Reports from the International Red Cross, U.S. Army records, and even testimonies from surviving Japanese prisoners paint a picture of relative fairness, adequate food, access to medical care, and opportunities for work or study. Compared to the near starvation and brutality many Allied POWs endured under Japanese guards, the contrast was undeniable. The phrase paradise on earth may not have been universally used by Japanese POWs, but it reflects the real shock many experienced. They were treated not as subhuman enemies, but as captured soldiers entitled to dignity under the Geneva Convention. This is the story of how Japanese prisoners, among them women, came to view their time in American prison camps with something approaching relief, and why history remembers those camps as far more humane than expected. Capture, surrender, and the first shock. For Japanese soldiers of World War II, the very concept of surrender was alien. Indoctrinated from childhood with the ideals of Bushido, the way of the warrior, they were taught that death in battle was preferable to the humiliation of capture. To fall into enemy hands meant not only personal shame but disgrace for one's family. The Japanese Imperial Army drilled its troops with the belief that Americans and other Westerners were ruthless, barbaric, and eager to kill prisoners. It was propaganda designed to harden morale and discourage surrender. But it also created a deep psychological barrier. This mindset made encounters between Japanese soldiers and Allied forces uniquely ferocious. On islands like Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa, thousands of Japanese troops fought to the death rather than lay down their arms. Civilians, too, were caught in this tragic spiral, with many choosing suicide over capture. Against such a backdrop, the capture of Japanese prisoners, male or female, was comparatively rare. When it did happen, it revealed startling contrasts between expectation and reality. The rarity of female POWs. The Imperial Japanese Army did not normally deploy women in frontline combat roles. However, thousands of women were mobilized in auxiliary capacities, as nurses, clerks, communication staff, or members of labor units. Some were civilians pressed into service on occupied islands, while others worked in military hospitals. When these positions fell to advancing American forces, women who might otherwise have perished chose capture as the only option for survival. Historical records suggest that several hundred Japanese women were eventually held as prisoners of war by American forces across the Pacific. They were a small minority compared to the 20,000 to 25,000 Japanese men who fell into U.S. hands, but their experiences were significant. For many, capture brought profound fear of abuse, starvation, or worse. What they encountered instead was something completely different: capture on the battlefield. The moment of capture was often chaotic. On islands under siege, Japanese soldiers hiding in caves or bunkers were flushed out with flamethrowers, explosives, or psychological warfare tactics such as loudspeakers urging surrender. Those who emerged alive did so expecting execution. Many later testified that they fully believed they would be killed on the spot. Women, in particular, braced for horrors. Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as savages who raped and mutilated captives. But instead, in many documented cases, American troops gave them water, food, and basic medical treatment. The shock of this first contact was profound. Survivors recalled trembling as they were searched or questioned, only to be stunned by the lack of violence. For women who had been told to fear the worst, the comparative gentleness of capture was their first glimpse of how different reality was from the propaganda they had absorbed. Transportation to prison camps. After capture, prisoners were typically transported to rear area collection points. Men and women were separated, and wounded POWs were evacuated for treatment. From there, they were shipped to larger camps in Hawaii, Australia, or eventually the continental United States. The journey itself was another moment of surprise. Prisoners expected to be beaten, starved, or paraded in humiliation. Instead, they were guarded firmly but generally without cruelty. American soldiers often seemed more curious than hateful. For some women POWs, the first full meal provided on transport ships, complete with rice, vegetables, and sometimes even sweets, was the first sign that life in captivity might not be the nightmare they feared. The logistics of moving POWs across the Pacific were immense. By 1944, U.S. forces had captured enough prisoners that dedicated ships were used for transport. Red Cross inspections ensured compliance with the Geneva Convention. Compared to the infamous Hell ships used by Japan to move Allied prisoners, where men suffocated in cargo holds and died by the thousands, the difference was stark. Word began to spread quietly among Japanese prisoners. American custody, while still captivity, was survivable. Arrival in American camps. Upon arrival in U.S. camps, prisoners were processed with military efficiency. They were issued uniforms marked with PW to identify their status, provided bedding, and given medical examinations. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition, rampant among soldiers fighting in the Pacific, were treated systematically. For many Japanese POWs, the availability of medicine was itself astonishing. Penicillin, still rare even for civilians in wartime, was sometimes administered to wounded captives. For female POWs, special arrangements were often made. Camps that housed women were segregated, and they were placed in roles suited to their backgrounds. Nurses might be asked to assist in medical wards, clerical staff worked in camp offices, and others joined work programs in agriculture or light industry. While restrictions were strict and freedom non-existent, the shock was that they were not being abused. Instead, they were being fed, housed, and even paid small stipends for their labor. The first taste of a different reality. It was in these first weeks of captivity that many Japanese POWs, both men and women, began to use words like paradise to describe their experience, not because life in camp was luxurious, but because it was the opposite of what they had been led to expect. Food was plentiful compared to wartime rations in Japan. The U.S. military supply chain ensured rice, bread, vegetables, and sometimes meat were distributed regularly. Compared to the starvation diets in Japanese camps holding Allied prisoners, American POW camps were astonishingly humane. For women especially, the discovery that they were not in constant danger of assault or execution created a sense of relief so profound that it colored their entire memory of imprisonment. The gap between the propaganda of inevitable suffering and the reality of structured humane captivity was so wide that many later described the experience in glowing terms. Why this shock mattered. The initial shock of capture and the first days in American custody were crucial in shaping how Japanese POWs perceived their captors. Fear transformed into grudging trust. For female prisoners in particular, the relief of safety was overwhelming. It was in this contrast, the expectation of cruelty versus the reality of relative decency, that the mythos of American prison camps as a paradise on earth began to take shape. Though life in camp was far from easy, these first experiences created the foundation for a narrative that would endure after the war. That surrendering to the Americans, once unthinkable, could actually mean survival, dignity, and even unexpected kindness. Life in American camps. Food, medicine, work, and education. When Japanese prisoners first arrived in American custody, the initial shock of survival quickly gave way to the routines of camp life. For both men and women, captivity was restrictive, disciplined, and often monotonous. Yet compared to what they had expected, or what their own country inflicted on Allied captives, the daily conditions were astonishingly humane. Food, abundance in the midst of war. The single most striking difference between Japanese expectations and American reality was food. Wartime Japan was plagued by shortages. Civilians back home survived on ration cards, with rice portions cut drastically and substitutes like millet, barley, and even acorns used to stretch supplies. Soldiers at the front often starved, their rations limited by the collapse of Japan's supply chains. By contrast, American prison camps reflected the logistical might of the U.S. Army. Rations were standardized, plentiful, and surprisingly balanced. Each POW received 3 meals a day, usually including rice or bread, vegetables, and some form of protein. Canned goods from American factories supplemented the menu, as did fresh produce from local farms. In some camps, prisoners were even allowed to cook their meals in communal kitchens, seasoning them in ways closer to Japanese taste. Female prisoners often recalled the astonishment of being served meat, eggs, or fruit at a time when such items were luxuries in Japan. Some joked in letters after the war that they had gained weight in captivity. To men and women who had braced for starvation, the regularity of meals alone seemed extraordinary. Medical care. Healing the enemy. Equally shocking was the provision of medical care. The Geneva Convention of 1929 obligated signatories to provide adequate treatment for prisoners of war, and the United States made a point of demonstrating compliance. Upon arrival, all POWs underwent medical inspections. Those suffering from malaria, dysentery, or tuberculosis, common ailments among Japanese soldiers, were treated in camp infirmaries. American doctors and nurses, often assisted by Japanese medical staff among the prisoners, administered penicillin and sulfa drugs, technology still rare in Asia at the time. Dental treatment, minor surgery, and vaccinations were also provided. For female prisoners who had worked as nurses themselves, the experience of being patients under American care was deeply ironic and sometimes humbling. They later admitted they were surprised at the professionalism of U.S. Army doctors, who treated them not as enemies but as human beings in need. Compared to Allied POWs held by Japan, who endured starvation diets, deliberate neglect, and rampant disease, the difference could not have been greater. The survival rate of Japanese POWs in U.S. custody was over 95%. For female prisoners, this survival rate was nearly universal, since they were not exposed to the same physical hazards as men on labor details. Work and productivity. Life in American camps was not without responsibilities. Prisoners were expected to contribute to the maintenance of the camp and, where possible, to the war economy in non-combat roles. Men were often assigned to agricultural or construction work. They harvested crops, cleared fields, repaired roads, or worked in sawmills. Female prisoners were usually directed into lighter labor more in line with their skills. Nurses and clerks were placed in medical wards or camp offices, while others worked in laundry, kitchens, or sewing units. In some camps, women were allowed to cultivate gardens, producing vegetables that supplemented their rations. Importantly, POWs were compensated with small stipends, tokens redeemable at camp canteens for goods such as soap, stationery, or even cigarettes. For many Japanese women, this system was bewildering. They had been told that Americans were brutal exploiters, yet here they were being paid, however modestly, for their labor. The stipends not only improved morale but also provided a sense of dignity. It was work, but it was not slavery. Education and cultural programs. Perhaps the most unexpected aspect of American captivity was education. U.S. authorities quickly recognized that idleness bred discontent, while structured programs could both occupy prisoners and serve long-term goals of post-war democratization. As a result, many camps introduced classes in English, mathematics, science, and even civics. Books and newspapers were made available through camp libraries, and some camps offered vocational training such as carpentry or mechanics. For Japanese women with backgrounds in nursing, clerical work, or teaching, educational programs provided continuity with their pre-war roles. Some attended English language classes, while others taught fellow prisoners literacy or arithmetic. Camp newspapers, produced under American supervision, published poetry, essays, and artwork by prisoners themselves. This atmosphere of intellectual engagement was almost unthinkable to those who had grown up under the rigid censorship of wartime Japan. Some female prisoners later admitted that exposure to Western ideas during captivity reshaped their views of the world. They discovered a freedom of thought and expression that contrasted sharply with the militaristic indoctrination they had known. Social life in captivity. Despite barbed wire and armed guards, POW camps developed their own social rhythms. Prisoners formed clubs, played music, and organized sports. In camps with women, separate areas were designated, but contact still occurred during shared activities. Baseball, in particular, became a favorite pastime, with American guards sometimes playing alongside prisoners. For women, Smaller social circles emerged around cooking, sewing, or gardening. Laughter, conversations, and even friendships crossed cultural lines. While still prisoners, many women described these moments as a reminder of their humanity. Something they had feared would be stripped away forever. The paradise perspective. It was against this backdrop that some Japanese POWs, including women, began to describe their camps as resembling a paradise. The term was not meant literally. Prison life remained constrained, boring, and occasionally harsh. But in comparison to their fears and to conditions in Japanese camps for Allied prisoners, the difference was night and day. To be fed, clothed, housed, and given medical care felt miraculous. The expression also reflected gratitude. Many women knew that, had they remained in Japanese-controlled territory, they might have starved or been sacrificed in futile last-ditch defenses. In American camps, they not only survived but often regained health and strength. For them, captivity represented safety in a world consumed by destruction. A broader message. American authorities were aware of this perception and sometimes encouraged it. Humane treatment of POWs served propaganda purposes, demonstrating the contrast between U.S. and Japanese values. Leaflets dropped over Japanese positions promised food, medicine, and decent treatment if soldiers surrendered. For women especially, the testimony of former prisoners became a tool in psychological warfare. Yet beyond strategy, the reality was simply that the United States adhered to the Geneva Convention with remarkable consistency. By doing so, it created conditions that many Japanese prisoners would later recall with astonishment and, in some cases, even nostalgia. Chapter 3: A stark contrast. Japanese camps versus American camps. The perception of American prison camps as humane, even paradisiacal, cannot be understood without examining the other side of the equation. The conditions endured by Allied prisoners in Japanese custody. To Japanese soldiers and civilians captured by the Americans, camp life seemed astonishingly decent not because it was luxurious, but because the alternative, as they knew it, was horrific. Japanese attitudes toward prisoners. The Imperial Japanese Army's approach to prisoners of war was shaped by cultural and ideological beliefs that were centuries old. The Bushido ethic exalted loyalty, sacrifice, and death in battle as the highest virtues. To surrender was to abandon honor. In practice, this meant that the Japanese military did not train to handle large numbers of captives, nor did it plan for their care. Prisoners were regarded not as fellow soldiers temporarily defeated, but as cowards unworthy of respect. This worldview clashed directly with the obligations of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but never ratified. In effect, Japanese authorities felt no legal or moral duty to provide humane conditions for prisoners. Instead, they prioritized their own military needs, often at the expense of POW lives. Conditions in Japanese camps. When Allied servicemen fell into Japanese hands in places like Singapore, the Philippines, or Burma, they entered a world of deprivation and cruelty. Food rations were meager, often just a handful of rice supplemented with watery soup. Starvation weakened prisoners until disease ran rampant. Malaria, dysentery, and beriberi claimed thousands of lives. Medical care was almost non-existent. In many camps, even basic painkillers or bandages were unavailable. Work was relentless. Prisoners were forced into brutal labor projects such as the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, where over 12,000 Allied POWs died of exhaustion, disease, or beatings. Guards routinely used violence to enforce discipline, striking or killing prisoners for minor infractions. Survival often depended on smuggling, camaraderie, or sheer luck. Women, when captured, faced particularly harsh treatment. Allied nurses in places like the Philippines were subjected to internment in overcrowded camps, suffering malnutrition, disease, and, in some cases, sexual violence. Though not all women were physically abused, the constant threat of exploitation created a climate of fear. The death toll reflected these realities starkly. Of the 140,000 Western POWs taken by Japan, more than 35,000 died in captivity, a mortality rate of roughly 27%. By contrast, in American custody, fewer than 5% of Japanese prisoners perished, most from wounds sustained before capture. The American approach. Against this backdrop, the American approach stood in dramatic contrast. The United States not only ratified but actively implemented the Geneva Convention. Camps were inspected by the International Red Cross. Records were kept of prisoners, who were allowed to send letters home. Adequate rations, clothing, and shelter were provided as a matter of policy. This was not simply a matter of benevolence. The U.S. government saw practical advantages in treating POWs well. First, it reinforced discipline among American troops, discouraging acts of revenge or brutality that could damage morale and international reputation. Second, it offered a propaganda weapon. If Japanese soldiers realized they would be treated fairly in American hands, they might be more likely to surrender. Third, it provided moral contrast to Japanese cruelty, strengthening Allied claims of fighting a just war. Why Americans seemed humane to Japanese POWs. For Japanese prisoners, especially women, the difference was jarring. They had grown up hearing that Americans were monstrous and that capture meant degradation or death. Instead, they found themselves in camps where they were fed, housed, and protected. Medical care was extended even to those gravely wounded. Guards, though firm, rarely engaged in gratuitous violence. In particular, female prisoners experienced a level of safety that contradicted every fear instilled by wartime propaganda. There were strict rules against fraternization, and American officers emphasized discipline to prevent misconduct. For women expecting assault, the absence of harassment alone was transformative. Many later recalled that they could sleep at night without fear, something unthinkable during Japan's chaotic final battles. To describe such conditions as a paradise was less about comfort than about relative comparison. In wartime Japan, civilians endured bombings, hunger, and severe rationing. In Japanese-controlled camps, prisoners starved and died in droves. In American custody, by contrast, the daily provision of food, medicine, and order felt extraordinary. The broader irony. The irony was that many Japanese POWs were treated better in American camps than their own civilians were back home. By 1945, food shortages in Japan had become desperate. Cities lay in ruins from firebombing. Families scavenged for scraps while American prisoners thousands of miles away received steady rations. This reversal of expectations deepened the shock. For female prisoners, the contrast was especially poignant. Many of them had been trained to believe that their role was to sacrifice everything for the emperor, even their lives. To find themselves alive, cared for, and within the limits of captivity, respected, was a revelation. Some would later admit that their time in American camps changed their understanding of the world, opening them to ideas of fairness, equality, and humanity that clashed with their pre-war indoctrination. A psychological turning point. The comparison between Japanese and American treatment of POWs carried lasting consequences. For the Allies, the memory of Japanese cruelty hardened resolve. For Japanese prisoners, the memory of American decency planted seeds of doubt about their own government's values. Historians note that some former POWs returned to Japan after the war with a new appreciation for Western systems of justice and democracy, having glimpsed them firsthand in captivity. The phrase "paradise on earth" emerged not because life in U.S. camps was idyllic, but because it was survivable, structured, and humane. Against the backdrop of Japan's brutal policies, the difference was night and day. For female prisoners who had feared the worst, that difference was nothing short of miraculous. Testimonies, memory, and the paradise on earth. By the end of the war in 1945, more than 20,000 Japanese prisoners of war were in American hands. Among them were several hundred women, nurses, clerks, communications workers, and civilians swept up in the collapse of Japan's island defenses. Their experiences, while diverse, shared a striking theme. Life in American camps was not what they had been taught to expect. In fact, for many, it was the opposite. The testimonies of female prisoners. Oral histories collected in the post-war decades reveal consistent patterns. Women spoke of their initial terror at capture, their shock at being given food and water, and their astonishment at the medical care they received. They remembered the first full meals, rice, bread, vegetables, sometimes meat, as almost overwhelming after weeks of near starvation. Some recalled that American guards treated them with a professionalism that contradicted Japanese wartime propaganda. "We expected cruelty," one former nurse said in an interview decades later. "Instead, they treated us like patients, like people. It was strange, almost unbelievable." Another testimony came from a communications clerk captured on Saipan. She described how she was certain she would be executed upon surrender. Instead, she was evacuated to a camp in Hawaii, where she lived in clean barracks, ate 3 meals a day, and was even given access to books. "It felt like another world," she said. "In comparison to what we thought, it was a paradise." While not every prisoner used that exact phrase, the sentiment was common. Captivity under the Americans was survivable, even humane, and therefore felt extraordinary. Male POWs echo the sentiment. Japanese men held in U.S. custody voiced similar astonishment. Many admitted that they had been warned that capture meant torture or death. Instead, they worked on farms, learned English, and in some cases wrote poetry or painted in camp newspapers. Letters home, monitored but permitted, allowed them to reconnect with families. For men who had believed they would vanish in dishonor, this humane treatment was transformative. The phrase "paradise on earth" circulated among prisoners partly as dark humor, partly as genuine relief. Compared to the jungles of New Guinea or the caves of Okinawa, camp life, with its regular meals, medical attention, and even occasional music or sports, seemed almost luxurious. Origins of the phrase. Historians debate exactly where the phrase "paradise on earth" first appeared. Some trace it to memoirs written by Japanese POWs in the 1950s and 1960s, when Japan was rebuilding and reflecting on the war. Others point to American psychological warfare leaflets, which highlighted humane treatment in order to encourage surrender. Whatever the origin, the phrase encapsulated the gap between expectation and reality. For Japanese soldiers and civilians indoctrinated to fear Americans as monsters, the act of being fed and treated decently was enough to feel paradisiacal. It was not that camps were luxurious. They were still prisons, with barbed wire, guards, and strict rules. But in comparison to the horrors of Japanese-run camps and the devastation back home, they seemed like sanctuaries. Memory and post-war Japan. The testimonies of former POWs played an important role in shaping Japanese understanding of the United States after 1945. Many returned with stories of fairness and humanity, which contrasted sharply with the devastation of firebombed cities and the suffering of civilians. In a small but meaningful way, their experiences helped soften post-war hostility and prepared the ground for the U-Japan alliance that would soon follow. Female prisoners, in particular, contributed to this narrative. As women who had been vulnerable to exploitation, their testimonies of being protected and respected carried weight. Their memories challenged stereotypes and demonstrated that even in war, there had been moments of decency. Historians' perspectives. Modern historians caution against romanticizing American prison camps. Conditions varied, and not all experiences were positive. Some prisoners felt isolated, depressed, or humiliated by captivity. Work assignments could be exhausting, and cultural misunderstandings were frequent. Yet when measured against the standards of the time, and especially against the brutal conditions in Japanese camps, the American record was remarkable. International Red Cross inspections, meticulous U.S. Army records, and post-war interviews confirm the general picture. Japanese POWs, including women, survived at high rates, received medical care, and were treated with a degree of humanity rare in the Pacific War. Why it mattered. The idea of camps as a paradise was more than just exaggeration. It symbolized the victory of law over vengeance. By adhering to the Geneva Convention, the United States demonstrated that even in total war, it would not abandon principles of humane treatment. This not only protected prisoners but also served strategic goals: weakening enemy morale, encouraging surrender, and reinforcing the moral legitimacy of the Allied cause. For the prisoners themselves, it meant survival. For women who feared the worst, it meant safety. For historians, it remains one of the most striking contrasts of World War II. While Japanese guards starved and brutalized Allied POWs, American guards provided food and medicine to their Japanese captives, even as the war raged on. The end of captivity. When the war ended in August 1945, Japanese prisoners gradually returned home. For many, reintegration was painful. Surrender carried stigma, and some hid their experiences for years. Yet the memories remained. Paradise on Earth became a shorthand among some groups of former POWs, a way to describe the surreal relief of captivity that brought not torment, but life. For female prisoners, the return was doubly complex. Some were stigmatized as tainted for having fallen into enemy hands. Others quietly resumed civilian life, rarely speaking of their imprisonment. Only later, in interviews and memoirs, did many share the details. The food, the safety, the respect. Their stories continue to challenge assumptions about war, captivity, and humanity. Conclusion: the story of Japanese prisoners of war in American hands, and the women among them who described their captivity as a paradise on earth, is not about comfort. It is about contrast. In a war defined by savagery, cruelty, and mass death, the relative humanity of U.S. prison camps stood out. For men and women who expected annihilation, survival itself felt miraculous. The phrase endures because it captures a profound truth. Sometimes, in the darkest of wars, the simple act of being treated as human can feel like paradise.